In 1845, London was radiant. With the world's largest shipping port and the world's largest economy, it attracted migrants in search of work from everywhere. From other regions in the United Kingdom, but also from overseas. Astonishing, except that the city was literally about to explode.
London was totally congested, morning, noon, and night.
So the roads were just unable to cope. There were sellers of goods, there were coaches, there were some omnibuses, horses, carts, just absolute chaos on the roads.
People began to complain, as business and finance were threatened. But nobody could come up with a solution. He was a member of the Liberal Party, on the left wing of the House of Commons, and solicitor to the City of London. What's more, he knew the capital inside out.
Charles Pearson was, oddly enough, a lawyer, but he was also a great reformer. He wanted people to live in better conditions, and that was very much part of his idea. If you could actually move some people outside the centre of London, they could live further out where they might be able to have a little house with a garden rather than living in some ghastly tenement.
Despite being neither an engineer nor a geologist, in 1845, Charles Pearson had a revolutionary idea: to create the world's first underground railway linking the city's main train stations: Paddington, Euston, King's Cross, and Farringdon.
Charles Pearson thought, well, this is just not going to resolve itself. We have to do something radical. You couldn't put railways on top of the land because there was too many buildings, too many roads. So he thought, what we need to do is to build underneath the ground.
Trains that would run beneath the city in tubes so as to free its streets of traffic. The project was outsized, the budget colossal. £1 million, the equivalent of $130 million today. And yet in 1854, he received the approval of the Royal Commission. The city would finance the construction of the subway in partnership with a railroad company. Pearson's dream was starting to come true. (1860), 6 years later, work on the subterranean megastructure finally commenced. The engineer, John Fowler, was in charge of operations. His task? To oversee the titanic work that would occupy thousands of laborers for more than 1,000 days. A 7-kilometer-long underground rail line, which would cut through the capital.
Nobody had built a railway through a city before. So how do you do it? Well, you couldn't dig so deep that you couldn't go to the surface because there weren't the methods available to do that. So it had to be just below the surface.
They purely and simply gutted streets. Or where there were no streets, knocked down entire blocks of housing to let the railroad through.
The method employed by Fowler came to be known as cut and cover. The excavation of trenches 10 meters wide by 6 meters deep would wreak temporary havoc in London. The interruption of all traffic. The digging of the trench in the middle of the street. The shoring up of the walls to prevent the tunnel collapsing. The construction of the tunnel in bricks, a material available in vast quantities. The covering of the tunnel with earth once built. And finally, traffic could resume.
Today, an enterprise like this would use JCBs and mechanical diggers and a whole armory of machinery to get the job done. But just to remind ourselves, these trenches for the world's first underground railway are dug by men with spades and picks using wheelbarrows. This is like your gardening project, and every inch of the world's first underground railway was dug by hand.
A phenomenal undertaking. But fortunately, John Fowler's laborers would benefit from a huge advantage: the subsoil of London.
North London is built on clay, which is an easy soil to kind of take out and remove. It makes kind of nice, neat kind of impressions, so it doesn't collapse the whole time. You can carve out of the clay a tunnel much more easily than you can out of other types of soil.
Thanks to this clay soil, work on the world's first subway advanced rapidly. And yet, this wasn't the end for Londoners, because another vast set of works, just as titanic as the subway, would require all their strengths once again beneath the streets of the capital, that of the sewers. In 1850, London was on the verge of a public health disaster. Added to overcrowding was another problem: the evacuation of wastewater. The city seemed to be bogged down in its own mire, and the stench was terrible. For at the time, there was no sewage system.
Human and animal waste was left to stagnate in the streets, or was piled up in cesspits, which were emptied every so often. It was a very rudimentary system.
There's a concentration of people in a very small, tight area, and they are almost wading, almost paddling, almost walking in their own sewage.
Open-air sewers emptied into the tributaries of the Thames before ending up in London's main river itself. What's more, back then, it was from this fetid, viscous River Thames that Londoners drew their drinking water. Putrid water in which an invisible murderer lay in wait, hoping to spread throughout the city: cholera.
It was a terrifying disease because there was no cure and no way of caring for people. Those sick with cholera tend to suffer from cyanosis and turn blue, which is why cholera was nicknamed the Blue Death.
Two deadly epidemics spread panic and fear in 1848 and again in 1852. In all, the disease killed almost 25,000 Londoners. And yet, no one made the link between cholera and the capital's fetid water. At the time, people believed that the disease was caught by inhaling the fumes emanating from the Thames, the infamous miasmas. So to get rid of the stench, the government turned to an engineer with proven experience on the railroads, Joseph Bazalgette. He was yet to know it, but Bazalgette was about to change the fate of London by building an astonishing subterranean superstructure capable of evacuating the capital's waste.
He knew it wasn't just a question of collecting wastewater, but of evacuating as far away from the capital as possible.
Joseph Bazalgette wanted to construct two independent sewage systems, one on the north bank of the Thames and one on the south bank. Each would comprise large interceptor sewers, kinds of water highways, to collect waste before it reached the Thames. These interceptors would then convey the waste far away from London to the estuary. On paper, the idea was superb. But in practice, there was still one major problem to overcome. How do you direct the waste towards the estuary with the technology of the time? Bazalgette would have a flash of genius.
He has a very clever light bulb moment, and it's using gravity. The sewer runs the length of the River Thames, and it descends to the sea. So Bazalgette is using the natural incline to help the sewage east and out and away.
At the time, the idea was revolutionary. And to make sure his system would work, Bazalgette calculated the minimum slope needed for water to flow naturally. It worked out at 40 centimeters per kilometer. The engineer planned everything, down to the minutest detail, even the shape of the tunnels.
This is a typical medium-sized sewer in London. This is for walking in. And this sewer is oval shaped, or we say an egg. And the shape is whether the volume is high or whether the volume is low, that the bottom will always be kept clean by the flow of the water.
So even when water pressure is low, wastewater collects in the small channels and continues to flow. In 1857, all the plans were drawn up. The engineer was waiting for one last thing before starting work: public financing. But against all expectations, his project was stopped dead in its tracks.
The cholera epidemic had already decreased, and the danger from that perceived to have decreased. And there was, as is ever the case, a reluctance to spend money.
Meanwhile, waste continued to pile up in the city, and every day 250 tons of wastewater were poured into the Thames. London seemed to be condemned to living in its own filth. As for road traffic, it was as dense as ever, because in 1863, despite the first underground rail line being almost completed after 3 years of work, the engineer John Fowler still had one big problem to solve. In the mid-19th century, trains were still pulled by steam locomotives. These worked perfectly well in the great outdoors, but they could prove deadly underground.
The big problem, of course, was that electricity had not been developed, diesel hadn't been developed, so the trains were steam engines. You couldn't really have a continuous tunnel for 7 kilometers, which would have just had too much smoke, and the ventilation would have been impossible.
So how could they prevent the London Underground from turning into a coffin? John Fowler's team came up with an incredibly ingenious idea: to build ventilation shafts. Locomotives would retain their steam about 30 minutes and then only release them when under a shaft, so that the poisonous gases would be evacuated to the surface. And constructing these shafts sometimes meant demolishing entire buildings. And in the wealthy districts, nobody wanted to see a gaping hole between two townhouses. So to preserve the architectural harmony, the engineers constructed movie set-like fake facades, like this one in Leinster Gardens. Who would believe that at numbers 23 and 24, this beautiful facade was hiding not a home, but a subway ventilation shaft? The final budget had risen to £300 million. But perseverance paid off, and the subterranean megastructure finally saw the light of day.
Amazing enough, the first line, just 7 kilometers, was built in about 3 years, and which was 6 months late, but it was remarkable that they attempted to do it that quickly, given that nothing like this had ever been done before.
On January 10, 1863, everything was in place for the inauguration. At Paddington Station, in the northwest of London, the stakes were high. Throughout the large-scale works, the press had led a campaign of rare violence against the London Underground.
Press initially were pretty skeptical about this scheme. They were saying, well, You know, nobody's going to use it. You know, it's going to be smoky and dark. It's going to be like going underground. Who wants to travel underground? You know, it's Stygian darkness. It's going to be frightening.
So, would Londoners dare to descend into the bowels of the capital and board the famous underground train?
Cleverly, the Metropolitan Railway announced that on the first day, travelling would be free, and people thought this was great fun, so they flocked to the railway. The trains were all full. 30,000 people went on the line on the first day.
In the first year, they recorded 9.5 million passengers, and in the second year, it was 12 million.
In the end, Londoners were won over by their new Metropolitan line, traveling at 16 kilometers per hour. The operation was a huge success. Nothing could stand in the way of the expansion of the subterranean superstructure.